Να σου πω ότι ο Ταγίπ Ερντογάν μαθαίνει ποντιακή λύρα.
Well, interestingly, Tayyip Erdogan might be learning how to play the Pontian lyre. I'm joking. This is an event on the Black Sea coast. It's highly emblematic because it epitomizes in a way what I will be trying to elaborate upon in the few moments that follow this first salute. Collective memory, cultural heritage, musical heritage, and politics in Turkey. This is but a token of my doctoral thesis and the in situ research I conducted in the area of Trabzon for 2 years, dwelling practically in this area to that purpose. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, whereas much has been written or said about the violent expulsion of the Greek population from the historic Pontus and the events around the genocide in the early 20th century, little did we know up until now about what really happened in this area past 1923, and most particularly the fate of the populations that continue to speak Pontian or Greek Romanian. Yesterday we have had the opportunity of hearing very interesting things from Tamer Çilingir, who experienced firsthand these processes. I will try to focus a bit further on the relationship between music and the notion of pertaining, belonging, especially for the refugee populations who after losing their homes and their people still have music through which to identify themselves, which is why we insist so much about our music, and there are Homeric disputes and our whole community life is axed around music. The genocide and the ousting of the Christians from Pontus has not been enough to eliminate the traces of Greek presence in this area. Interestingly, these traces continue to affect the mentality and the lives of today's inhabitants of the eastern part of the Black Sea in the northeastern Turkey. One of the most important remnants of this Greek presence in the area is music. When I myself for the very first time visited Pontus, my mind was filled with lots of questions. Before my first trip to this area in the mid-90s or so was it, as a young student at the time, and with no internet or Facebook around, not to mention YouTube. I'm not that old, mind you, but still. Well, communication with today's Pontians was, if anything, quite limited. And when for the first time I met in Constantinople and later in Trabzon, young people playing the lyre and singing in Pontian, Romaic as they refer to this language, the surprise was huge. And I was also impressed by the very intense presence of lyre in public spaces, especially in Trabzon. I will show this to you in due time. As a young student, I found it hard to believe and wonder how come these people still play the lyre in this area. I frankly didn't know. To that moment I believed that only us in Greece keeps using this musical instrument, and that the Trabzonian friends of mine believed that them and only them the world over are those who use this language and play the lyre. So that was a mutual surprise, believe me. I wondered time and again how is it they think about what the lyre and music means to them. Is it the same as what we feel? How are these people perceive the past, their language and history? Slightly later, as a student in Constantinople, I struck bonds with Trabzonian lyre players and singers and started to have a better grasp of what happened to the community of these people past 1923. Of course, my highest interest was in the field of the Pontian lyre and music and the central role that music is meant to play in shaping the identity of these people. I was therefore surprised initially by the fact that some of my interlocutors in Trabzon considered lyre to be a Turkish instrument, which was unheard of as far as I'm concerned. Some described the lyre as an instrument of Trabzon, the local instrument, where others, although less in number to be frank, believed the lyre was inherited from the Greeks who left the area. So there were 3 different versions about the origins of lyre, Were they Turks bringing this over from central Turkey? Were the Greeks who learned how to play the lyre from the Turks? Or is the lyre a local instrument everybody was acquainted with, common heritage, and only a few who believed that the Pontian lyre is what is left over from the Greeks of the area who were expelled later? The various concepts, the values and the narrative developed around the lyre charmed me and urged me to more seriously orient myself to scientific research, trying to delve better into what the lyre means for the inhabitants of Pontus, Greek-speaking and non-Greek-speaking, and an intellectual adventure was about to begin. What was really impressive when I started to come to grips with it was the role that Islamization played in the way people of the area heard and perceived Pontian music. In a very interesting text published sometime between 1924 to 1925, an author named Parcharides, he might be a relative of yours, sir, someone who lived for 4 years in the Christian villages of Office, and in the late 19th century also served as a teacher, primary school teacher, described in that text that he visited time and again the Greek-speaking Muslim villages of the area of this mountain and tried to take stock of their songs. And in that text, Parcharides even suggests that he has been unable to come across a rich musical heritage because of Islamization, and because Islam in many cases even prohibited listening to music in these areas, that led to music becoming marginalized and the musical culture be greatly forgotten as far as the Pontian lyre is concerned. Many of my interlocutors in my research even told me that in their villages it was even perceived as a sin to listen to Pontian lyre, and there were many imams visiting those villages where lyre was practiced and urged in the inhabitants to refrain from listening to lyre because it is an instrument of the infidel, but meaning the Christian. So them, as good Muslims, should not indulge in listening to this kind of music, rather they should turn to other better things, which of course resulted to quite a proportion of the population becoming estranged in this area from the musical culture and heritage of Pontian lyre, and if not eliminated, the lyre was stigmatized and even marginalized to a certain extent in this specific zone. One of my interlocutors, a very well-known lyre player, even said to me that to him it is a shame to listen to recordings of dead lyra players because it is something tormenting. Of course, it is a local interpretation that the imams reproduced in order to estrange people from this culture, because officially Islam does not prohibit music. But if you are truly committed Muslim, you do feel scruples listening to Pontian lyres, because this is a Christian instrument, and if these are recordings from dead musicians, this is yet another problem, because you're dead, so better not listen to it. And what is the outcome? You get cut off from this musical tradition, and essentially you're a different person. Moreover, there is a quite diffuse perception in areas around Trabzon that to learn lyre, one must have committed 13 very critical sins to become a good lyre player. So all these perceptions have stigmatized the practice of playing, never mind listening to lyre. Hence the very extensive marginalization. Despite the stigmatization of Pontian music and lyre because of the shifting towards Iran or Islam, this musical culture did not die, rather it survived, although under attack continually as of the shaping of the national state of Turkey. So, within the context of the establishment of a Turkish national state in what used to be Anatolia after 1923 and throughout the 20th century, the creation, the performance and the listening to music was under control by the state authorities. Consecutive governments in Turkey prohibited or even repressed public performance of songs featuring verses in the local patois and languages of the various inhabitants, urging them to only sing in Turkish. Very interesting. One might sing English publicly, but if you attempt to sing in Pontian or Kurd, that was an issue. That was a kind of propaganda, of very virulent propaganda, disillusive propaganda, and upon the urge by Kemal, a long-term policy was shaped towards promoting Turkish folk music to incorporate various non-Turkish Ottoman populations and communities along with their musical heritage. As part of this assimilative policy, there were commissions set up for the taking of stock, collection and categorization of songs and music from all communities. Gradually but steadily, there was a database with songs, some 4,000 of them from the onset, that were to be the basis for the creation of a national Turkish folk music. The commissions that were assigned this task, musicologists and national researchers, collected the verses of the songs in other tongues and dialects, Kurdish, Alazin and Greek, and replaced them with new verses in Turkish. And in so doing, they also changed the meaning of the song, hence a loss of the roots and history of the song that is cut off from the past. The songs that could not get new verses in Turkish were set outside the record and left to oblivion. Even songs coming from the Turkmen communities of Anatolia and sung in various Turkish idioms themselves suffered a linguistic Turkification with some differentiations that led to the creation of a common, let's say, formal linguistic and musical code. Still, the intervention of the Turkish government did not just aim the verses of the song and the lyrics, it also aimed the instruments and the whole tune. So part of the propaganda at the Ministry of Culture was the setting up of commissions for the processing of those tunes in order to become part of the Turkish folk repertoire. Those commissions determined and even imposed specific rules of performance of each tune. In so doing, they changed even the sonorization of each song. It is the very way under which a melody is experienced. Sazi or baglama, this instrument, which was considered to be the national folk instrument, although it is played throughout the Middle East, became the most emblematic instrument at TV shows and performances, promoting through state networks of this very specific nationalized repertoire, contribute to the marginalization of other instruments and echo colors. Melodies, tunes that were played accompanied by the Pontian lyre started being performed accompanied by this instrument in public shows and manifestations. Turkish folk songs, which to this day are hosted at TRT, the Turkish state channel, are performed by state performers and are concoctions as a result of state policies for the creation of a national repertoire. If ever this happened in Greece, could you imagine what would have happened if the government issued an order saying that from now on all folk music in the land will be performed accompanied by bouzouki and no local instruments can be allowed? Can you fathom the depth of the change this would have triggered and how this would affect the way whereby people perceive themselves? Essentially, it's a kind of cultural leveling and forced assimilation. This is the utmost level stage of genocide. Now about the role of the Turkish extreme right and how is this connected with the Pontian lyre. During my research I was able to locate quite a number of interesting elements in musicology records. Mahmud Ragib Gazi Michal, considered to be the father of modern Kemalist Turkish musicology, delved himself personally in the taking of record of stock and collection of Pontian lyre music. Gazi Michali, back in the 30s, published a very brief text in the nationalist Turkish newspaper VIII under the very typical rubric in Turkish, Where have the Trabzonians found the lyre? In that text, Gazi Michal, speaking about Greek and Armenian inhabitants of the eastern Black Sea, suggests these two peoples did not have their own musical tradition and dances, so they imitated the music and dances of their Turkish neighbors. Similar examples were developed with respect to Kurdish music. Gazi Michal also goes as far as suggesting that the Greeks of Trabzon referred to this instrument as lyre, whereas Turks call it kemence, a Persian word for an instrument played with a spike. Michal also suggests that the lyre reached the coast of Trabzon in the 13th century together with the arrival of the Genovese merchants, suggesting it came from the west. And he says we should not be looking for Greek, Armenian or Georgian influences upon the musical culture of the inhabitants of Trabzon. 37 years later, in 1967, another investigator and author, Inham Baran, in a text of his about lyre, says the following. The fundamental instrument of Trabzon is kemence. The roots and the story of this instrument are unknown. It is reputed that the Greeks invented it. The Turks, because of their religious convictions, hesitated in playing this instrument, but later on they started playing and becoming equally good. The whole debate about the historic origins and the national descent of this lyre and the production of relevant texts continued throughout the 20th century in neighboring Turkey. The main idea about this instrument was shaped by the Turkish extreme right by way of publications and other events. This is a lyre manufacturer. I don't know whether he's still around. He has been manufacturing lyres and has gone as far as sticking the Turkish flag upon it. The narrative of the Turkish extreme right suggests lyre is an instrument having reached Trabzon from Central Asia together with the Turkmen tribes that arrived there in the 13th century. This was later transfused through the culture and the artists that identified with this kind of ideology and produced it. The administration believed that the musical policies they would be following would contribute to the creation of a common sense of belonging amongst citizens of different cultural and geographical references, whilst enhancing the creation of Turkish national conscience towards the consolidation of homogeneity and the creation of a new national state. The lyre of Trabzon, just as any other instrument in Anatolia, for many listeners in Asia Minor, was identified with Turkish hyper-nationalism and radicalism. This is a 45 round record featuring music and speaking about the liberation of Turkish Cypriots from their Greek oppressors, or so they say, but you shouldn't listen to that, it's really irritating. So that is how songs were created about lyre, paying tribute to the state and the army, praising the occupation of Cyprus, also praising the assassination of Hrant-Dink, the Armenian activist, whereas there are other songs that criticize the US and Israel, stressing the imperial grandeur of Turkey. These kind of songs were promoted by state-owned TV and radio stations, whereas artists performing them have been widely promoted and even financed. Otherwise said, the point and lyre was utilized as a means of propaganda for the ideas of the extreme right to be propagated. To cut a long story short, the lyre was identified with quite a number of negative ideologies and experiences. And this is yet another very typical picture coming from Kuiri al-Aygur. That's the name. It is a public ceremony as of which they put a lyre suspended from a crane, because as of late there is a propaganda going about suggesting that Pontian lyre originates from this area. This is not Trabzon, it is in Kerasus, and sorry, Kaiserli. This is where it comes from, and this is quietly disputed as to where the lyre comes from. Trabzon people say it comes from Trabzon. Those from Kaiserli say they come from Kayseri. It's not just a caprice. It goes deeper into the fair dispute about the national origin of the inhabitants listening to this instrument, who plays the best, who are the best performers, and so on. It is by far not an innocent discussion as to whom the lyre pertains. Another very typical example, and for those of you who have visited Trabzon have definitely come across these monuments. Ethnic music in Turkey started to become ever more present over the last 15 to 20 years, especially subsequent to the rise of the AKP Islamic movement by Erdogan in early 2000, and what with the relative tolerance it was met with in publicly using verses in languages other than Turkish. Up to that day, that is, up to the time of rise of Erdogan in power, any recording of songs and music in any non-Turkish language of Anatolia was legally prohibited, and most above all, politically and morally stigmatized as a dilutive propaganda. So, what with Erdogan's arrival in power, this policy loosened up, because originally AKP was mostly concerned about the religious identity of the inhabitants, never mind what kind of song you're singing or in which language you sing. To the extent you go by the state and identify with the state's policies. So in the beginning of the Islamists, as they came to power, did not find such different languages and idioms to be a threat to them. The critical thing was to be a good Muslim and faithful to the regime. And being a good Muslim was also about using the appropriate language and idiom. Here is a typical picture from a local feast in Trabzon against the typical background of Mustafa Kemal, and here's the Pontian lyre with Che Guevara in the background. Now leftist groupuscules in Trabzon and the area are adopting this instrument as means of promoting their ideals. I will be elaborating further on this in due course. Despite the repression and the marginalization in several decades, these songs and idioms have survived to this day, as you know, and are still spoken in different areas of Turkey. Moreover, despite the formal policies and despite the lyric homogenization, some local cultures still survived, albeit traumatized, and as of late, a first version in Armenia, Hems in Armenica, Lazic, Syrians, Georgian, and Kyrgyz verses were heard, spoken by people who live in this area. Within this context, therefore, of the revival, both musical and lyrical, songs performed in accompaniment of the Greek lyre started to go about, sung in the Pontian idiom, Romaica. Besides formal performances and CD distribution, many young musicians and their fans also use Facebook and YouTube to diffuse their production. One is Trabzon, and besides enjoying their favorite music from the internet, they wish to trigger a debate. The various posted videos with Pontian lyre and verses are followed up by thousands of people in Turkey who are also posting their opinions about the quality of the verses and about the quality of relationship to the Greeks. The Pontian lyre and lyrics urge some of the listeners to think over their initial perception about their family origins and even challenge the official narrative. To others, this posting of Pontian songs are a risk to national security and they should be avoided. In other cases, there is a very particular idealization of the immediate past in Turkey that is featured like an effort to fraternize Greeks and Turks in Trabzon. It pays to retain how this imaginary space of the media in Turkey, if not monitored by the government, are the only open forum of debate for the identity of the current people of Trabzon, when other channels of communication are under the oppressive control of the state and social organizations supported by the government. Thus, a new public space is created where opinions are heard that otherwise would have been left in the dark. Then there is a translation in Turkish of some very typical examples posted by listeners under videos of music on YouTube. Quoting one such comment, a friend penned a comment about a song and its national origin. We should not scorn others for stealing our songs. It is true that our Black Sea people are those who translated the Greek songs in Turkish. Even the Muslim lyre player, one mentioned in one's comment, as we know, learned playing the lyre from a Greek fellow villager. If only the Greeks of Black Sea had not been forced to flee, we could have stayed on and be friends and brothers. If only you could listen to the old lyre players playing the lyre, they make it sing like a bird. One way or another, says another, the lyre is a Greek instrument and everybody was learning from them. Another comment, when listening to these sounds and songs, I can be only very angry at those who became the reason for Greeks and Turks to split. What a trap we fell in. How nice would it be if we were good neighbors to Armenians and Greeks, and anathema goes to those who split us apart. Another comment, I don't want to be mean, but some of you here fall in the trap. Wake up, read about what the rest write. Don't be more royal than a king. Don't be too good to the Greeks. Don't forget the Greeks massacred us in Smyrna using axes. If you were good Turks, you would never trust these immoral Greeks. And more, hundreds of these comments go about on the internet.
Η συζήτηση που αναπτύσσεται γύρω από την φύση
in his debate about the characteristics of Pontian music, we see this is a phenomenon going way beyond the limits of a music lover debate. For many citizens of Turkey, this is a reminder of an oppressed and marginalized local past. The new perceptualization is a long process with social and political impact through the circulation of music played with the lyre. People who do that contribute to the creation of nostalgia about the past and a feeling of belonging, which has either been lost or tends to be eliminated as a result of political repression and assimilation campaigns. Quoting the last words by Ahmed, one of my informants in Trabzon. At the time he lived in Ankara. Ahmed's channel on YouTube and his page on Facebook, he keeps posting Pontian songs with lyre players from Greeks in Trabzon, became the focus of interest for thousands of citizens of Turkey who wanted to learn more about Pontian lyre, as well as the music and the story of those living in Trabzon. Let us see how himself perceives this rise of interest in local Trabzonian story and civilization, and what his role could be in this process. So in translating Ahmed, it is by far not easy to maintain the unity of a country like Turkey, established on territory where most local names are Greek. To so doing, they had to invent.
της χώρας. Αυτός ο εχθρός ήταν οι Έλληνες.
So the Greeks were the enemy. The enemy was cultural, which is the reason why for many years the state policy tried to deroot the culture of Trabzon. This is why every evening on TV we heard so much against the Greeks, and that created lots of animosity. Those people used the word Greek as a blasphemy. I am open, I am ready to risk everything for the lyre and our identity, for the Trabzon people to learn the true story, who they really are. There are so many people in Trabzon today who are afraid to declare how they feel and what their identity is. Ahmed says, I believe that through my activity on the internet and through the circulation of Pontian songs, I will be facilitating the dialogue, break down taboos, and help people express themselves freely. Everything should be discussed freely and without fear. Besides isolated cases of activists like that of Ahmed I described, there are organized leftist groupuscules who, through the posting and circulation of songs, image and sound, are trying to recreate the collective memory of the audience. What is being challenged through practices is the official state perception on national homogeneity, history and identity. The importance of musical sound and music as a whole in shaping ethnic identities now acquire a new and very interesting dynamic with the use of social media by younger musicians and listeners. Moreover, the creation of new forms of sociability and perception about identity in Turkey through music on the internet is a very interesting social phenomenon that presents quite a lot of similarities to the activist movements and experiences of the indigenous populations throughout the world. The rise and use of new technologies removed the state and corporate monopoly in the creation and circulation of music and content in Turkey. Political activists use this kind of music and instruments to establish a new kind of education of fantasy. A new co-experience is being encouraged that scribes within the context of the Kemalist propaganda and bureaucracy. Those participating in the internet creations create alternative narratives of the past and deconstruct the predominant perception of story. Gradually but steadily, I see happening kind of Hellenism within these leftist networks of Trabzon, a new fantasy of friendship, albeit imaginary, amongst Greeks and Turks, something that starts to be experienced as people move about on real friendships, not virtual friendships that stricken, creating a relationship that does not rely on state policies, rather it relies on the nostalgic sound of point and lyre that unites people wherever they are. Thank you very much.
Ανοίξτε το μικρόφωνο παρακαλώ.
Λοιπόν, ήθελα να συγχαρώ.
Μιλήστε.
Να συγχαρώ, Νίκο, για την πολύ καλή.
I would like to congratulate you, Nikos, on your very well documented presentation. No one could have made such a presentation better. Before I give the floor to those interested in posing a question, allow me to ask a question. When was Lyra first played in Pontus? Off the mic. The speaker is off the mic. Well, the truth is that it is quite difficult to define the exact timing. I think it is a medieval Greek Byzantine instrument, but I'm not in the position to prove it right now. Well, I'd like to know whether the musical instrument could have any relationship with the genocide, meaning the impact of music on the neuronic pathways. I think there is a kind of connection or impact or influence, but I'm not a doctor. I study the social dimensions of musical sound, but I believe there is such a connection, and I believe it would be worth studying. There is no such study yet. I don't know what the findings would be, but it would be an interesting approach, I believe. Two more questions. Mr. Michailidis, I got to know you through the internet when you played in Pontus. You showed a CD, I don't remember the name, but I bought it in Kusantasi in 2003 because my father was still alive back then, and he told me, when you go to Turkey, bring something back to me. The music you would listen to, the Yemedze, the Turkish music, was an was too intense. You met the local lira players, and it was a delirium, and I think that they learned from us, and they play the same way we would play in the past. Well, there are two main methods of playing the lira, the Eastern and the Western. Trebizond has a uniform style which is very similar to ours, indeed. And why so? They are the descendants of Islamized Greeks. So, if we go westernwards, in Keresunda, well, there is a Turkmenic gender, Ichepni. They live there, and they learned how to play lira, most likely from the Greeks as well. However, they play in a very different way. And what is interesting is to actually see the local memory, how the locals remember the sounds. People in Trebizond don't really listen to the lira played in Keresunda. So there is a kind of dispute between them, and there are differences. I'd like to refer to Adem Ekiz, who is a Turkish artist. When I met him in 2017 in Surmena, we were invited by him, by Adem Ekiz, to an event, to an evening event, and in his when he addressed the public, he said, "I'm not going to say welcome to you because I consider that you are in your homeland, in your country." Adem Ekiz had the courage, the boldness to actually declare his national identity, the fact that he feels more Greek. Do other Turks feel the same way? To what extent? Well, no, that's my answer. The issue of identity is not a black and white issue. Mr. Tamer Chilingir told us yesterday that this is a long-run process, to fully understand and realize who you are. These populations have suffered years of anti-Greek propaganda, and it's not easy to question that propaganda. Let me talk, Chair. Well, I'm pressured by the committee here, the organizing committee. Anyway, Mr. Moisidis is the General Secretary of the International Confederation of the Greeks of Pontus. I'm not sure whether I can talk about what I'm about to say now. I'd like to say hello to all of you, of course, and to say that today I heard the news and I heard that Erdogan asks for reparations for the genocide which was perpetrated by the Greeks in Turkey or against the Turks. Do you have an opinion about that? Do you have a question for the speaker? Well, that's my question for the speaker. And well, I believe that the stance of the Greek governments over the past decades has been a bit irrational and problematic. And I believe that the narrative of the foreign policy, the foreign affairs policy of Greece should change, should be modified vis-à-vis Turkey, because the genocides need to be recognized, because this culture of impunity has led to a very specific political culture, which is not marginal. It is the mainstream political culture in Turkey. If we, in Greece, for example, we speak about the Golden Dawn, for example, which was a marginal phenomenon, though it became part of the Hellenic Parliament for a while. Well, in Turkey, there are many different Golden Dawns, and it is a mainstream politics, so we need to change our public speech, and we need to set the issue of the genocide as a prerequisite, and the recognition of it as a prerequisite for the democratization of Turkey. A last question by Mr. Fotiadis. Well, a Basque country says, what kind of homeland would we have without our language? Do you believe that through your studies in music, of music, and going beyond the limits the Turkish state wanted to impose? Apollos Lervi, for example, says that I'm Greek, and he clarifies that, and Musular and others. Anyway, Melve, when she says that my mother tongue is the Pontic language, the Pontic dialect, and this is the only language I can express myself in. You know, home, the mother tongue is mainly expressed in mourning, in pain, in suffering. When you can mourn about your beloved ones, your loved ones, in a language, then it's not your mother tongue. Well, music does miracles, works miracles. We've done many things about music. One of the future scholarships will be a scholarship about the language of Greek-speaking Muslims and about ways to achieve a better communication and connection with them. Well, what I want you to take home from my speech, if I may, is that the issue of genocide is not just about physical violence and the mass extermination of the peoples. It is an ongoing process. It actually constitutes an effort to erase the traces of the presence of a population on specific territories by following specific policies, such as the language, music, arts. But such traces cannot be easily erased. They revive, they resuscitate from their ashes. And this is something that appears clearly in the field of music, because music goes deep inside people. And given that music, through music, people shape their imagination and their feelings, well, identities are shaped and reshaped through music. And this is why many regimes try to control artistic production, because they shape the thoughts and the feelings of people. Okay, let us have a short break of 10 minutes now for a cup of